Today we're going to look at translating between fractions, decimals, and percents. First, we're looking at decimals and identifying all of the different place values. When we're talking about our place values, it generally helps to start from the decimal point. As you go to the left, we have our whole number place values that start with ones, tens, and hundreds. They're a part of the ones period or group. Then we have thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, which are a part of the thousands group. We have millions, 10 millions, and 100 millions, which are a part of the millions period. And billions, 10 billions, and 100 billions, which are a part of the billions period. As we go to the right, we have our decimal places. So these mirror the whole number places, except they skip the ones place. And at the end, we have a THS to tell us that it's a decimal. So we have tenths, then hundredths, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, and millions. So when we're trying to read numbers, we need to identify the place value. One way to remember this is to place a 1 in the ones place and a 0 in the places after. We either cover the number with your hand to what place value you're rounding to. For example, if you're rounding to the nearest tenth spot, cover all digits after the 10, and that is the tenths place. So if we look at the example, 2.56895341, we need to tell which digit is in the tens place. You can see at the bottom of the screen, I've used that shortcut of putting my 1 in the ones place. So if I look at just the tens for the tenths place, didn't put the box around everything, the 10 for the tens place, I see that a 5 is in the tens place. If I look at the thousands place, I want 1, 10, 100, 1,000 right here. That tells me that 8 is in the thousands place. If I'm looking for the hundredths place, that 0 lines up with the 6. And if I'm looking for the millionths place, I have tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, and then millionths place. When we're rounding decimals, we look to the number next to it. And when I say next to it, I mean to the right of it. If that number to the right is a 5 or higher, we add 1 to the number we're rounding and drop all numbers after it. If it's a 4 or lower, we leave that number alone and drop all numbers after it. So if we're rounding 2.548 to the nearest hundredth, 4 is currently in the hundredth spot. The 8 next to it tells us to bump that 4 up. So I'm going to bump it up to a 5. The numbers before it, that 2.5, stay the same, and I drop anything after it. If I look at that same number, 2.548, and round to the nearest tenth, 5 is in the tenths place, and 4 is directly to the right of it. That 4 tells me to leave that 5 alone. So I'll write 2.5, and my answer stays that. I drop any numbers after it. When we're talking about changing decimals to fractions, if there's a whole number before the decimal, we need to put it in front of the fraction and your answer is the whole number. Then we need to take all the numbers after the decimal point and put them on top of a fraction bar. So anything that's after the decimal point becomes our numerator. Then we put the place value in the bottom of the fraction bar in our denominator and we reduce the fraction. We can always check our work by dividing the denominator into your numerator. So if I look at this first example, 3.125, that number in front of the decimal, 3, is going to stay my whole number. This 0.125 becomes my numerator. And then if I look at my place values, I have tenths, hundredths, thousands. So I need to put 1,000 in my denominator. Then I can simplify. I always want to simplify a fraction if I can. So I'm going to divide by their common factor, which is 125. There are other common factors, but 125 is the greatest, or the GCF. So if I divide there, I'll only have to divide once. The whole number 3 stays the same, and my fraction part of this mixed number becomes 3 1/8. If I wanted to double check my answer, I could do 1 divided by 8. That gives me 0.125. And that 3 in front of it gets me back to that original number. If I look at this next example, my whole number part is a 0, so I don't actually need to write that 0 anywhere. Then if I look at what comes after the decimal, I'm going to ignore all the zeros and just take that 25 and make that the numerator. Now I do still need to worry about those zeros when I'm trying to find what place value it's in. I have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths. So I need to put 100,000 in the denominator. Just like before, I can simplify. 25 divides both numbers. When I divide by 25, I end up with 1/400th. Just like before, if I wanted to double check my answer, I would do 1 divided by 400, and I would find that that does give me that same decimal we started out with. Now, when we're talking about multiplying and dividing, if we're multiplying or dividing by powers of 10, it makes our life a lot easier. If we're multiplying by 10, we move the decimal point to the right however many times there are zeros on the 1 to make our number bigger. So for example, if we start out with this 6 and we multiply by 10, I'm going to bump that decimal point 1 space to the right and fill it in with a 0. So I'll end up with 60. Right, I had my 6, I bumped it 1 space to the right. If I'm multiplying by 1,000, I'll take my decimal point at the end of that whole number and go 1, 2, 3 spaces to the right. So I'll end up with 6,000. For 100,000, I need to bump it 5 spaces to the right. So I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros for 600,000. For 1 million, that's telling me to bump my decimal point 6 spaces to the right. So I end up with 6 million. If I look at this last one where I have 4.325 times 100, remember I'm bumping my decimal point 2 places to the right, not just adding 2 zeros at the end. So I'll end up with 432.5. If I look at this right-hand side of the table, we're also going to deal with powers of 10, but we're going to look at dividing by them. This time, we move our decimal point to the left by however many zeros there are to make the number smaller. So if we have our 8, remember our decimal point's always at the end of our whole number, we would bump it 1 space to the left when we divide by 10, and that gives us 8/10. If I'm dividing by 1,000, I need to take that decimal point and bump it 3 spaces to the left. So that gives me 0.008 or 8 thousandths. If I'm dividing by 100,000, I need to take that 8 and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the left and fill in those blank spaces with zeros. For 1 million, when I'm dividing by 1 million, I need to bump 6 spaces to the left for the 6 zeros. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that gives me 5 zeros after my decimal point, and then an 8. If I'm dividing this 48.36 by 100, I need to go 2 spaces to the right, so I'll end up with 0.4836. If we're talking about going from decimals to percentages, we need to multiply the number by 100 and add a percent sign. So if we have that 0.38 and I'm trying to go from a decimal to a percent, I'm going to multiply by 100%. Remember when we multiply by 100, we bump that decimal point 2 places to the right. So that's going to give me 38%. If I look at that next number in the table, 12.5, in my decimal form, I want to multiply by 100% to get it in percent form. When I multiply by 100, I bump my decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So I'm going to end up with 1,250%. If I look at that 0.001, I'm going to multiply by 100%. When I multiply by 100, I bump my decimal point 2 places to the right. So I'm going to end up with 0.1%. If we're trying to go in the other direction, go from a percentage to a decimal, I'm going to divide the number by 100%. So if I have 85%, I divide by 100%. The percents cancel out to just give me a decimal, and when I do that division, it gives me 0.85. Remember, when you divide by 100, we're bumping the decimal point 2 spaces to the left. If I look at 4.5%, I can divide by 100%. The percents are going to cancel out, and that's going to give me 0.045 when I do my division. And then if I look at that last example, we have 1,305%. We're going to divide by 100% to get it in decimal form. Those percents cancel out, and we end up with 13.05 in our decimal form.